Afternoon class. Our topic for today is going to be about sexual reproduction in plants again. So this is a continuation. But today we'll talk more about fertilization and then later on seed dispersal. Okay, so as an overview of this lesson, you can find all the information on this lesson on page 187 and 188. And like I said, we'll be talking about fertilization, the development of an embryo after fertilization, and then later on we'll talk about seed dispersal, or basically the different methods that plants use in order to disperse their seeds. Okay, so in my last video I would have talked about pollination. So next we'll talk about fertilization. Okay, so after pollination would have occurred and a pollen grain lands on the stigma of a flower, the next step that would take place is fertilization. Now, the way that this is going to happen is that once this pollen grain lands on the stigma has this type of nutrient inside of it that is basically going to stimulate this pollen grain to grow a pollen tube down the style of the stigma. Remember, the style is basically the neck of the pistil, or basically the part that's going to connect the stigma to the ovary. So I'll try to zoom in a little bit. Okay, so you see this long line right here. This gray line at the center of this is a pollen tube, and it's growing from this pollen grain that would have landed on top of the stigma. So this pollen tube is going to grow down the style of a flower and then make its way into the ovary and then finally into the ovule. Okay, so this pollen tube is literally growing down, the style, and then eventually it grows into the ovule. The ovule is going to have a tiny pore or opening called a micropyle. Okay, so that's how the pollen tube is going to reach the the ovule that has an egg cell inside of it. Now remember, this is sexual reproduction. The sexual reproduction, you have a male gamete fusing with a female gamete. Or in other words, you're gonna have a sperm cell fusing with an egg cell. So it's the same thing in this scenario here. Basically, the male gamete is going to be a cell that's basically traveling down this pollen tube, and that's going to release a male nuclei, and that nuclei is going to fuse with the egg cell. Okay. Now remember, with gametes, these are sex cells. And like I said, you have egg cells, you have sperm cells. Remember that they have a haploid nucleus inside of them, which means that uh, basically the nucleus inside of it is going to have half the amount of chromosomes inside of it. Okay, so that's why I refer to it as a male nuclei. Okay, basically it's coming from the male cell. Okay, so you still have two halves basically joining together, and that's going to fuse and create an embryo. So the same way how it happens in animals, where you have a sperm cell fusing with an egg cell and that creates an embryo, a similar thing is going to happen inside plants when it comes to sexual reproduction. Okay, so that male nuclei or male nucleus is still going to fuse with the female nuclei, okay, once it gets to the egg cell. And like I said, that is going to create an embryo, okay? So after uh, the embryo would have been created, or more specifically, the zygote would have been created, the next step is that this ovule is now going to slowly develop into a seed. Okay, so once the zygote is formed, it's going to slowly grow into an embryo, and it's going to start growing a embryonic plant, which is going to be the plumule and the radicle. okay? And then also it's going to create a cotyledon, okay? So to recap what I said so far, the male cell and the female egg cell, they're going to fuse with one another. Their nuclei are going to fuse. This is going to become a zygote now, and that's going to continually to divide and grow and develop until it becomes an embryo. Okay, so in this early stage, you just have the plumule here, which is going to, which we call the young shoot, and we have the radicle, which we call the young root. Okay, so in addition to that, like I said, you'll also have the cotyledon. Okay, and in the case with monocots, you'll have a plumule, a radicle. You'll also have one cotyledon, which is why we call them monocots, because they have one cotyledon. And you will also have an endosperm that will be created. Okay, so uh, at that point where the male nuclei or the male sex cell would fuse with the female sex cell, we call that fertilization. And once that occurs, that's going to create a zygote, and that zygote is going to develop into an embryo, and eventually it's also going to create a cotyledon, and collectively we call that the seed. Okay, so the final product of fertilization is that that zygote would eventually develop into a fully formed seed. And like I said, inside dicotyledons, their seeds are gonna look a certain way, and inside monocotyledons, they're gonna look a little bit different. They're gonna have one cotyledon, and they're going to have an endosperm. Now, in my next video, I'll talk more about germination, where I'll talk about the different roles, more, I guess, detailed as it comes to, you know, the different parts of a seed. For example, the cotyledon, this is going to store food for this plant as it's growing or as it goes through germination. But like I said, I'll cover that more in detail when I do my next video. All right, so let's recap on what we learned so far. After pollination occurs, which is when a pollen grain lands on the stigma, a pollen tube is going to grow from the pollen grain and grow down into the style towards the ovule. The pollen tube will then enter the ovule from the micropyle. Remember, the ovule, this is found inside the ovary. The ovule is basically the egg cells that you're going to find inside the ovary of the flower. And it's going to have a tiny opening called the micropyle. And this is how the pollen tube is going to enter the micropyle. Now remember, the pollen tube basically is delivering the male gamete or sex cell to the ovules, where it will then fuse with the egg cell. And once that happens, that's going to create a zygote. Okay, so the final points, ovule has the female gamete inside of it. The pollen tube releases a male nuclei into the ovule. And like I said, that's going to fuse and create a zygote. And at this point where you have the fusion of the male sex cell and the female sex cell, that's what's when fertilization is going to occur. So fertilization is basically the union of these two sex cells with one another. The union of a male sex cell and a female sex cell in order to create an embryo or a zygote. Okay, so at this point, we call this fertilization. This is when a male sex cell and a female sex cell fuses with one another to create a zygote. Okay, after this zygote would have been formed, that zygote is then going to develop into an embryo as well as eventually creating a seed. Okay, so firstly, the zygote is going to, you know, continue to grow. The cells are going to continue to divide, and it's going to get, I guess, more complex and a little bit larger. And then eventually that will form the plumule and the radicle, as well as the cotyledon. Okay, so at that point, you have a seed. You have the plumule, which we call the embryonic shoot, and we have the radicle or the embryonic roots. These are the structures that are basically going to grow into the roots and the shoot once these seeds would have started to germinate. And you also have the cotyledon, which basically serves as a food source to supply the plumule and the radicle with food as it's growing. Okay, and like I said earlier, with dicot plants, they can have two cotyledons. With monocot plants, they can have one cotyledon, and they're going to have an endosperm. Now, the endosperm is also a food store. Okay, now before this seed is fully formed to becoming a complete seed, uh, you know, basically this is going to be a process. It's going to start off as a zygote, and it's going to slowly become mature over a period of time. So as this seed is growing, inside of the ovaries, uh, whenever this plant creates food, from its leaves by doing photosynthesis, some of that food is going to be stored inside of the seeds. Okay, that's going to be stored inside the cotyledon. And this food that's being stored inside the cotyledon will be useful to the seed once it goes through germination. Because like I said earlier, uh, that growing embryo is going to need some type of food in order to supply it with energy as it starts to grow. All right, so towards the end of the seed fully developing, you have the ovule that's going to become the seed after the ovule will have been fertilized. The outer layer of that ovule is going to become the seed coat, and the ovary that the ovules were inside of are now going to become the fruit. Okay, so the ovary is going to swell and become the fruit. Okay, so let's say we started off with this original flower here. Okay, so let's go back to a familiar picture of a flower, or a diagram of the flower. Okay, uh, this part here is going to be the ovary, and inside the ovary you're going to find the ovules. The ovules are going to become the seeds, and the ovary are going to become the fruit, or the fleshy part of a fruit that a person would typically eat. Okay, now the next thing that's going to happen, as the seeds approach maturity and as the fruit is now mature and full, the petals of this original flower is now going to fall off. The stigma and the style are also going to fall off, and this is only going to leave behind the new fruit and the seeds, inside of the fruit. Okay, so let's say, with this picture here, this is showing the picture of a guava flower. This is how this flower would have originally looked. Okay, this is before fertilization would have occurred. Okay, once fertilization occurs and the seeds inside the ovule start to mature and develop, this flower is going to slowly grow into a fruit. Or more specifically, the ovary of the flower is going to grow into the fruit, and the ovules are going to become the seed. Okay, and like I said, all of these other parts of the flower are going to fall off once this fruit would have fully matured. Okay, so once again, all these little seeds that you see inside this guava fruit, these used to be the ovules, and the fleshy part, that would have been the ovary of the flower. All right, next we're going to talk about seed dispersal. All right, so a couple of things to know when it comes to seed dispersal. Basically, up to this point, we would have talked about, how plants do sexual reproduction. We know that plants are gonna do pollination first, so a pollen grain is going to land on the stigma of another flower. This can happen in a number of different ways. You have wind pollination, you have pollination caused by insects, you have pollination that can be caused by water currents. Okay, after pollination happens, then you have fertilization. Uh, a pollen tube is going to grow from this pollen grain, and it's going to grow into the ovary and into the ovule, and then it's going to fertilize that ovule. That pollen tube is carrying a male nuclei or a male gamete, and that is going to fuse with the egg cell that's inside of the ovule. And then, like we said, earlier in this video, once that happens, then that's going to develop into an embryo and a cotyledon. And then as it continues to grow, it's going to become a complete seed. Now, the next step when it comes to, I guess, reproduction, even though technically in this case it's no longer reproduction because, the seed would have already been formed. And now the only thing that's waiting to happen is that the seed is going to land someplace, and then it's going to go through germination where it will develop into a plant. Now with seed dispersal, this just basically talks about the different ways that plants have come up with helping it to spread its seeds. Okay, so one of the main benefits of seed dispersal is that it's going to prevent overcrowding. Okay, it's one thing to have a plant that has the ability to create seeds, but if it has no way of spreading out these seeds, then after a couple of years you'll just have a bunch of the same plants growing in the same area, and that's going to create a problem because all of these plants are going to need a certain amount of space. All of these plants are going to be competing with one another to get different minerals and nutrients out of the soil. And then after some point, it's going to become problematic for those plants because now they are competing with one another. So with seed dispersal, plants just basically have different ways of helping their seeds to spread out so that this problem can be avoided. Okay, so before we continue, let me give you a definition of a fruit. A fruit is a seed-bearing structure in a flowering plant formed from the ovary. Okay, the fruit has two functions. It's going to help to protect the seed, and it's going to help to disperse the seed. Now, we'll talk about, I guess more specifically, the different types, the different ways. Okay, now we'll talk about the different ways that fruits are going to help the seed to disperse itself. Okay, so the first type of fruit we'll talk about, they're called succulent fruits, and another name for them is that all right, the first fruit we'll talk about is called succulent fruits. Another name for succulent fruits is fleshy fruits. Okay, so with these fruits, these are the fruits that you would typically find some type of pulp inside of. The pulp is going to be, I guess, sweet. It's gonna be, I guess, water. Okay, the first type of fruit we'll talk about is called the succulent fruits. Another name for succulent fruits are fleshy fruits. Okay, so with these fruits here, these are the fruits that we typically associate with actually being a fruit. These are going to be the fruits that have a sweet taste. They're going to be fleshy, or they're going to have, I guess, a high water content. So an example of some fleshy fruits, you have a mango, you have an apple, you have grapes, watermelons. Typically, when you think of a fruit that you eat that's actually going to taste sweet and have a pleasant taste, it's usually going to be a succulent fruit. Okay. Now, the strategy when it comes to succulent fruits of seed dispersal is that a lot of these fruits are going to be edible. Actually, the majority of these fruits are edible. They're going to have some type of sweet or pleasant taste, and that's going to attract different insects or animals or even people, towards these fruits to eat them. Now, in the case with the animal, they may eat these fruits whole, such as a bird. Let's imagine that a bird is eating a berry, for example. If it eats the berry whole, it's going to swallow the seed, and whenever it poops out the seed. That seed is going to land someplace else. That could be miles away from the tree. That could be tens of miles away from the original source where that seed would have come from. So that's how that's going to that's how succulent fruits are going to help trees to spread their seed, because animals are going to come eat this fruit and then potentially move this seed someplace else. Now, another example of how uh, fleshy fruits spread their seeds, in the case with humans, if a fruit is sweet enough that a person, takes favor to them, they may just take all the fruits from that species, plant a bunch of seeds, and then have an entire farm. Now, obviously, having a farm, that would be beneficial to that type of plant. Okay, so with a corn plant, for example, you know, this plant just wants to, reproduce and spread out its offsprings so that its species can survive. Because I guess that's the overall goal of every living thing, to help that its species to survive. So with the corn plant, because it's so useful to humans and that it has a nice taste to people, humans will basically help this corn plant to reproduce by having an entire farm of these corn plants. So obviously that's going to be beneficial to humans because now they have a source of food, and that's also beneficial to the corn plant because now they have some type of way or some type of system that's going to help them to further reproduce. So once again, that's going to be beneficial to that species because now it has no issue when it comes to reproduction. Okay, so the person or the human is basically going to help them to disperse their seeds, and this is the case with every single edible succulent fruit that people like, where we basically take the role of dispersing their seeds for them. Okay, the next type of fruits, they're called dry fruits. Now, these are basically the opposite of succulent fruits. Now, with a dry fruit, there's not going to be a fleshy part that you can necessarily eat, uh, or at least it's not going to be succulent. It's not going to have that high water content, such as a mango, for example. You won't be able to get any fruit juice from dry fruits because, as the name implies, they are dry.